Germans, what do they teach you in school about Adolf Hitler?
We're currently covering Hitler in school. I'm from Germany. Mostly, they talk about him in a very neutral way. We learned about how he came to power, started World War II, and so on, but when it comes to the horrible things, like the murder of millions of Jews, teachers usually say how bad he was. Back in 9th grade, I spent half a year studying his history and the history of the Nazi regime, and now we're going over it again in the second half of 11th grade. So we actually know quite a lot about the Nazis, and the government really doesn't want us to forget about that brutal past.
Support us by liking, subscribing, and leaving a comment. Just a few clicks for you, but a huge motivation for us to grow. Got questions? Drop them below. We read everything and always reply. The best ones might even show up in our next video.
Overall, World War II and the Holocaust are covered multiple times during school. In 7th grade, during religion class, I read the Diary of Anne Frank. In grades 8, 9th, and again in 12th grade, the topic of Hitler's rise to power and the Holocaust usually comes up. That said, some speeches or political system principles are analyzed in other classes, not just history. That's the general approach to teaching. Now I'll explain what exactly we're taught. In primary school, they tell you how bad Hitler and the Nazis were, how many people died because of them, and what the Holocaust was. Later, they explain how Nazism affected Jews on a personal level, the Diary of Anne Frank. Then you learn how the Nazis came to power, why Germans voted for them, and how propaganda worked. Finally, you start analyzing the conditions that made ordinary people become killers or fanatical soldiers of the Third Reich. As you can see, it starts with a simple black and white division, then you find out why those people came to power, and eventually you ask yourself whether you could have been one of them and how to prevent this from happening again. Alongside this, some students visit concentration camps. I've been to Buchenwald and Hadamar, where people with disabilities, for example, were killed. On top of that, in different classes we analyze art or songs from that period.
Well, first we learned about World War I, and then we were told how Hitler started out, his childhood, how he got into politics, and so on. Then it was World War II and the Holocaust. After that, we visited a concentration camp not far from Berlin, and, it was truly chilling walking around there and seeing it all. We saw gas chambers, beds, clothes, and the numbers that were given to people instead of names. We even met a person who had survived the camp. I can't even imagine what he went through.
He went to a concentration camp. Wow. We never got taken to one. But once we went to the Valentin bunker near Bremen, where they had planned to build a submarine factory. We also visited a prisoner camp called Sandbostel, where workers were kept in extremely harsh conditions, especially Russians. They told us that people had to eat wood shavings just to survive.
I'm Austrian, but I think that counts too. Right now we're studying World War II. First we learned about World War I and its aftermath, then about how Hitler came to power and became chancellor. Our current topic is the Anschluss. We watched a video of Hitler's speeches, and next year we'll go on a field trip to Mauthausen to visit the concentration camp in that area. I read the Diary of Anne Frank on my own, not as part of our school curriculum. Our teacher generally keeps lessons fairly neutral, but sometimes, like when we watched a video of Hitler's speeches or discussed the deportation of the Jewish people, she emphasized just how truly horrific that period of history was. I think that if we didn't have an understanding of how many people suffered during that time and how many lives the war cost, history would be much more likely to repeat itself.
We're given detailed, structured information, not focused on one specific person, but rather on the system and the chain of cause and effect that led to Hitler's rise and consolidation of power. The topic starts with World War I. I think that if you woke me up at 3 in the morning, almost 20 years after I finished school, and asked why Europe became a powder keg in the early 20th century, I'd immediately mumble in my sleep. Militarism, nationalism, and imperialism. Oh, and yeah, given all that, it's a bit uncomfortable to think about the US in that context right now. By the way, teaching requirements in the US might be different in Germany. In Germany, if you want to teach history, or any other subject, you basically need the equivalent of an American master's degree in that subject. My 12th grade history teacher even had a doctorate in history. I went to a public school, not in a rural area.
I'm not German, I'm actually Japanese. I lived and worked in Germany in the 1950s. The country was still on the recovery stage, and traces of the terrible war were everywhere, affecting the whole nation. I became friends with Germans who lived in the same area as I did. When they found out I was Japanese, they considered me a friend. You could say they saw me as an ally. We talked about the war and Hitler, and a couple of my friends rather openly praised the good they believed Hitler had done for Germany. After World War I, Germany was in a pretty bad state. They told me how Hitler came onto the scene, restored the country, and gave people a reason to feel proud and optimistic about its renewed prosperity. They condemned Hitler for his treatment of Jews, but some still repeated the old prejudices toward the Jewish people that Germans held before and during the war. At their request, I shared how my relatives in Japan had embraced the nationalist rhetoric of that era, but now regret that their country moved toward militarism. Just like the Germans who spoke about the country's prosperity and the end of crushing poverty after World War I, my relatives in Japan shared how their lives improved under the new regime, which unfortunately led them into World War II and new hardships. Both my German friends and my relatives in Japan embraced and supported their leaders without realizing the horrors that would follow.
My grandparents were Austrian, and the Holocaust broke them deeply, morally. They truly and sincerely believed that Hitler was doing the right thing. The propaganda worked exactly as intended.
Our history lessons were taught in chronological order throughout all of middle school. By the time we got to the topic of World War II, we were already mature enough to study Hitler and the war. That's why the history classes were actually conducted in a fairly neutral manner, with the teacher focusing on facts and historical context. The topic of World War II, Hitler and the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime, also came up in other lessons, both in middle school and elementary school. We read books about that period of history, watched films, went on field trips, and so on. When this topic came up in those classes, the discussion was usually about all the horrors brought by the Nazi regime and what it meant for people of that time, both victims and regime supporters. We also tried to think critically and analyze why this could have happened and how to prevent such events from recurring. In the end, the underlying theme of all these lessons was ethics, morality, human behavior, human flaws, inhumanity, awareness of one's own shortcomings, and the responsibility we all must bear to understand what is happening, how it happens, and how to prevent it. Naturally, all of this was taught and discussed differently depending on our age. It's worth noting that Germans usually learn about the Nazi past not in school, but even before that. Things about the war are often shown on TV, on magazine covers, and so on. Plus, some still have elderly relatives who lived through that time. My grandparents were 20 years old during World War II, so I learned a few things from them. For me, school kind of brought together all the bits and pieces I already knew, forming a broader picture and helping me understand much more.
I think most schools in Germany do a good job of teaching us about our country's history. I mean, there's a reason why Germans aren't particularly proud of being German, although nowadays we can be proud. Of course, we were told about concentration camps and other terrible things. Our teacher presented it very vividly, with pictures and recordings of speeches, and it really stuck in our minds. Naturally, all this information was very upsetting, and maybe it was quite harsh to pour so much negative content onto young children. But what I consider truly important is that we learned a lot about how Hitler even came to power and how things went wrong from the very beginning. We also tried to connect it to what is happening around the world right now. All of this made us more informed about that time, its details and its problems, things my friends and I often talk about. In general, despite Germany's unpleasant history, we try not to forget it, and schools constantly work with children on this topic. It's probably not like that everywhere, but it should be.
In my case, we covered the topic of Hitler quite extensively, not only in history class, but also in ethics and philosophy lessons. And it wasn't just in one year, but throughout my entire secondary school education, from 5th to 13th grade. In history, we learned about the political structures that led to the First, and consequently the Second World War. In philosophy, we discussed how, in our opinion, we would behave under such a regime. In ethics, we watched films like A Clockwork Orange and The Experiment. Our school also went on a trip to Dachau. That was horrific, and that's putting it mildly. It's important, I think, for every German to visit a concentration camp at least once. There's no specific law or rule about it, but most schools I know arrange trips for their older students. And it's not just schools. Our history TV channels like N24, NTV also do a lot. I mean, a lot. They produce countless documentaries about World War II. In every major city I know, there are many museums, Mahndenkmäler, memorials of shame or something like that, and monuments dedicated to those who resisted, like the White Rose, a group that fought against the Nazi regime. On top of that, there are daily reminders, which are especially important now that a new racist party has been gaining more and more power. It's honestly frightening, as if some people haven't learned anything at all.
I'd also like to hear from people in other European countries, especially Poles, Czechs, Austrians, Hungarians, and Slovaks.
I'm from the Czech Republic. I'm not really sure what else to add. Our school curriculum is almost identical to Germany's. We're taught about both world wars, and we first learned about Hitler in middle school, then in more detail in the upper grades. And our history doesn't stop there. After the war, the Soviet Union forcibly made us part of it, and we're taught about that too. That's probably the last major topic covered in high school history. And of course, that part is mostly presented in a negative light.
I'm from Hungary and studied here in a very liberal Jewish school. In our lessons about Hitler, the topic was covered quite objectively. We visited Holocaust memorials and studied in a building that had literally been used to hide Jewish families during the war.
which, even without extra explanation from the teacher, gave us a clear understanding of what cruelty means.
I'm Austrian, and we take this topic very seriously. We don't sugarcoat anything that happened. Some teachers are very good at showing just how terrible those times were. They explain how Hitler rose to power through all sorts of questionable methods and became a role model for an entire nation in such a short period of time, and all of it just to destroy everything again. First the Jews, and then, essentially, he switched to a kamikaze mode, dragging the whole nation down with him. Dark times. I wouldn't be surprised if modern teachers try to draw parallels between Hitler's methods of rising to the top and the questionable tactics used in recent events, like Trump's campaign or even Brexit. Support us by liking, subscribing, and leaving a comment. Just a few clicks for you, but a huge motivation for us to grow. Got questions? Drop them below. We read everything and always reply. The best ones might even show up in our next video.